On this episode of This Week in Space, we visit with Steve Jurvetson, Titan of the new space age.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 31, recorded on September 30th, 2022. Investing in the Stars. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Investing in the Stars edition. I'm Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra magazine, and I'm joined, of course, by the inestimable Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief at space.com. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Rod. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm just fine. I'm coveting that chair that I've now won, let's see. Well, twice. If we're moving it in November, I think I've got 2 months worth of dibs on it. So get that wheel.
No, that means you lose. You said October, and if they move it into November, we got to redo it again. So that means that right? It's like the lottery.
Yeah, okay.
It's like it rolls over, and then we have to recast our projections for Artemis 1.
All right. Well, but more importantly, today we're talking with Steve Jurvetson, Newspace investor and venture capitalist, though that undersells him by quite a bit. He's been guiding investment in new technologies since the Hotmail days. He was critical to the success of Planet Labs, Tesla, and SpaceX, to name just a few. We're going to talk more about this. He finished his undergrad electrical engineering degree at Stanford in just over 2 years. Still want to know how that works. At the top of his class, went on to graduate degrees in engineering and business. He designed microprocessors at HP before getting into venture capital. And this is not puffery. When I interviewed you in the past, Steve, the air gets pretty thin up where you're thinking. It was thrilling. And finally, of course, and perhaps the most important, you have the coolest collection of space race memorabilia outside of the Smithsonian, and you share it with people, which is very generous. You're sort of Captain Cool. How are you today, Captain?
Doing well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for making time for us. Before we embark on our journey to the stars, I'm just going to subject you to a couple of short jokes. So, hey, Tariq, why don't aliens eat clowns?
I don't know. Wow, a clown joke right off the bat. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Why don't aliens eat clowns?
Because clowns taste funny.
Bad jokes.
Okay, crickets right up front. Why did Mars dump Mercury?
Why? Why did Mars dump Mercury?
Because she preferred a plutonic relationship. Plutonic. That didn't.
Bad from dad jokes to bad jokes.
From bad to worse. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's hit some headlines. Tariq, what's our Artemis update for this week?
All right. Real fast. Artemis in the barn. The Hurricane Ian did prompt NASA to roll back. It's in the barn. They got an extension on that whole waiver thing with their flight termination system that we've been talking about ad nauseum the last few weeks. And that was for September 27th and October the 2nd. They're not launching at any of that time. So they're looking at mid-October, but most likely November right now. But NASA's waiting. They got to clean up the Kennedy Space Center because Hurricane Ian passed right over it as a tropical storm on Thursday of this week as we're speaking. So that was yesterday. And but they're reopened, minimal damage.
So, Steve, you're the engineer in the room. Would that storm have been dangerous for that rocket, in your opinion?
Oh, I don't know. Just given how other Boeing products have reacted to rain, I think you'd probably want to minimize the exposure of all your thrusters and all your componentry, but it would be a guess. Those $500 million mobile crawlers, too, you're willing to put them through their paces. So yeah, it's probably safer to put it in the barn.
Well, good to hear that the Air Force extended the battery warranty once again. We'll see if they're willing to do it into November.
Yep.
Big story. The DART mission worked.
Kapow!
Space.com. On September 26th, exactly as planned, NASA's DART spacecraft slammed into Dimorphos, a 500-foot space rock orbiting the larger asteroid called Didymos. While neither of these were immediate threats to Earth, the mission was designed to prove that a kinetic impactor could shift the trajectory of an asteroid. And that's the first step in learning how to divert threatening asteroids that might be on a collision course with Earth. We'll learn more about how well it worked over the next few weeks as Earthbound observers watch Dimorphos' trajectory shift in its quick 12-hour orbit of Didymos, which is one of the reasons why it was selected, because it's something you can measure quickly. What's next? NASA has a long-planned Earth-orbiting telescope called the Near-Earth Object Surveyor, or NEO-Surveyor, that's been awaiting full funding for a long time under various mission names. And the key to this is that if you're going to divert asteroids, you have to find them first. And to detect some of the remaining larger objects out there that could be threatening, which is about half of them, we're going to have an orbiting telescope to do that. And if you're interested, you can learn more about this at the National Space Society's website, and the organization is pushing for full funding for that project. Go to nss.org.
Yeah, I should point out I was there in the room at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab when DART smacked into the Dimorphos asteroid at like 14,000 miles, and people there were like cheering, like "Come on!" Like physics wasn't going to make it happen unless they were cheering. But they hit it like almost. I think they were about 17 miles from the center of their target. The center of Dimorphos is what they said, and those photos. Are amazing.
Meters, right?
17 meters, probably not miles. Yeah, 17 meters. The photos are amazing. The little CubeSat that Italy built worked just fine. They have already seen images from the James Webb Space Telescope and Hubble. It's been pretty amazing, and we should know in the next 2 months, they said, if they've actually moved it the amount that they wanted to. But the entire analysis period will run about 6 months. So.
All right. And you've got a story for us, sir.
That's right. Hot off the press from late last night, NASA and SpaceX had a press conference with the Hubble Space Telescope people in the afternoon. And it was surprising because they announced it in the morning that they were going to do it. But SpaceX and NASA are now officially looking at the feasibility of sending a Dragon spacecraft to the Hubble Space Telescope to potentially reboost it into a higher orbit and give it, and I'm not kidding here, another 15 years of life is what NASA said yesterday. I mean, Hubble is an iconic space telescope, and just the fact that they're considering this when, we all thought after the 2009, I think is the last mission, STS-125 servicing mission, that was it. It was just going to fall back to Earth instead of, end up in the Smithsonian. But
now, is there a servicing plan or just a nudge?
Right now, this is a feasibility study for reboost only. It's going to last about 6 months, is what SpaceX's Jessica Jensen said, and they're going to work with NASA to say, what could they do in terms of reboosting. There isn't a docking compartment that Dragon is built to handle it right now at Hubble, although they did add a soft capture mechanism on it for on that last servicing mission. So they're going to look at it, see what they can do. Jared Isaacman, who may be familiar to space fans as the financier behind SpaceX's Inspiration 4 private mission, and as well the 3 missions on the Polaris program, where they're going to fly another private Dragon mission. This second mission of those 3 could be this Hubble visit. And then, of course, the first crewed Starship flight. He was in the press conference, and it wasn't really sure why. Like, is he financing the mission or not? So that's why there's a lot of speculation that he wants to go and help do something for Hubble. But, NASA's game for it to see if they could do it and then figure out how it gets paid for in the future. And it's really exciting because if they can reboost it, which would mean somehow grappling onto Hubble, firing the Dragon's thrusters into a higher orbit, they would get like many more years of life out of this space telescope that's been, just a game changer when it comes to understanding our place in the universe. And maybe it sets up something in the future where an even larger spaceship that SpaceX is building, Starship, maybe goes up and grabs it, brings it back to Earth, and it ends up in an actual museum like it was meant to before the end of the shuttle era. But very exciting stuff.
It's going to end up in Steve's office.
Master plan.
Actually, speaking of you, Steve, as you're a man of means, when I first saw the original story about Jared Isaacman and Inspiration 4, I thought, I wonder if Steve Jurvetson is a pilot, because that would make sense, was the next kind of follow-on. So, I don't want to unveil any of your secrets, if any, but it seems like, it would make sense.
We'll get to space tourism later, but I'm in no hurry to be on an early mission. But I did purchase Jared's watch that he wore, a beautiful white ceramic watch on that first mission in a charity auction for St. Jude. So
nice.
So I am accumulating artifacts from each of these missions.
Well, for a good cause. So congratulations. That's great.
And I should just point out that both of those stories are from space.com by Mike Wall, and also I think by Teresa Polterova. Okay.
And here's a story from everywhere. The Space Force Anthem. So this is in the You Gotta Be Kidding department. The U.S. Space Force recently released their new fight song, which was not immediately well received by the netizens, dubbed cringeworthy by some. To me, it sounded like a theme for the Mickey Mouse Club, but that's because I'm of a certain age. You be the judge. I present you, Ant, if you are ready, Sempra Supra.
Yay!
And there we go. So after 100 years of incredible movie scores, 1,000 years of Western musical tradition, at least, and lots of skilled composers coming and going. And if you look around YouTube enough, lots of people that had penned better pieces, in my opinion, for what it's worth, that would have been inspiring. This is what they picked. This competition was run by the general in charge of Space Force. There were 12 submissions. That's John Raymond. This particular one was composed by James Teachnor. I hope I got his name right, who is an Air Force veteran and a songwriter of some note. But golly, I don't know. I would have taken Darth Vader's Imperial March myself, but what do you guys think?
Wait, you got boldly reaching into space there.
What's that, Steve?
Oh, sorry, is this the real Space Force song? I thought it was for the Netflix television parody.
No, that's the one they're actually choosing. Now, it does have a John Philip Sousa vibe to it, which may have been what they were going for. But, you know, it's been a long time since John Philip Sousa was composing. And I guess you have to have some connective tissue to the other service songs. But I mean, you know, you listen to France's national anthem, or you listen to Scotland's national anthem, or one of the British marches for, you know, their various military activities. And then you hear this and you go, gosh, not quite bringing tears to my eyes, not in a good way anyway.
I think it's fun. You've got boldly reaching into space. Although We're the Space Force from on high is a little kind of creepy because it means that they're watching you all the time. But hey, if you've got to have a theme song, it might as well be one a marching band can play, right? As someone that was in a marching band. So.
I was too, and we played better stuff than that. All right, well, we could talk about this all day. Maybe we'll get the composer on at some point. We can ask him what he was thinking. We will be back to talk to Steve Jurvetson after this short message, so stay with us. And we're back. So let's jump right in. Steve, you've been instrumental in creating or growing some of the most daring technological adventures in our time, especially with regard to space and associated activities. Can you kind of give us an outline of your path from Stanford grad to the venture capital community?
Well, sure. Well, thank you for those kind words and kind introduction. I've always been a technologist or a geek at heart. So back in high school, I programmed the Apple II. I was certain I wanted to go into electrical engineering when I got to my undergrad days at Stanford. I did whiz through that quickly, as you mentioned, and didn't feel like leaving. So I rolled right into a master's program and started a PhD, actually, focusing on what we would now call machine learning or neural networks. But I left that program soon after starting. I'd worked some chip design jobs, then went to the business side. I went to Bain & Company for 3.5 years, working for high-tech clients on business issues. Went back to business school, worked summer jobs at Apple and Next because Steve Jobs, again, was a childhood hero and just wanted to see what he was like in action. And try and also figure out what I want to do with my life career-wise. I've been bouncing around from engineering to product marketing to consulting. And during business school, I actually discovered venture capital as a possible career choice. I had never known venture capitalists growing up. It was all new to me. I did a sort of crash course in learning as much as I could while I was there, and a bunch of interviews, and I ended up at a small firm where I was the third partner. It was called Draper Associates at the time. And that started my venture career, 27 years ago now.
And just really quickly, Steve, for folks who may not know, what is a venture capitalist? Like what's the whole
what's that all about? What's that shtick? Yeah, there aren't too many job titles with the word capitalist in it. You know, it is kind of a weird reminder to me that I must be a capitalist. But generally speaking, this is the part of the investment community that is the most early stage, risk seeking, company building as it goes. So you have investors, of course, in public markets, the buying and selling, stocks you can buy in the, day trading or as a professional. And then on the other end of the spectrum in venture capital, at least the traditional definition, the way I like to think of it, is you're investing in people with a big dream, an idea of how they're going to make the world a better place, but they've done nothing quite yet. Maybe they have a prototype at most. They certainly don't have customers. They don't have revenue. They don't have a team. They don't have a brand. They have nothing but their idea and maybe a couple of co-founders at their side who are setting out to change the world. And that's what we spend all of our day looking at, trying to decide who to invest in. And we raise pools of capital from a whole bunch of other investors. So we have a standing pool of capital available to invest in a variety of startups that are trying to make the world a better place. And my particular focus is on deep tech, which includes space, of course, and is meant to exclude, internet and enterprise software and all the usual categories that get plenty of investment attention. And I'm looking more at the one of a kind companies that, if they succeed, history books will be written about, but oftentimes they don't succeed. So, it's also a very risky business, so to speak, where most of the time the companies don't succeed, but when they do, they can really make a difference in the world.
And were you always interested in just space flight and exploration, or did that come from getting into the venture capitalist front at the beginning, or were they already like going on separately? And then you just
no, that's a good question. It started at work, and I guess I could put it this way. Back when I was a child, I did go to a quote space camp at Johnson Space Center, but I then moved on to computer programming in my entire studies, and it never considered aeronautical or sort of aeroastro kind of course of study. So it really was a latent desire / interest at best. And I would maybe characterize it as like many kids that lived in the 60s and 70s was like, wow, there's a lot going on. Is this an exciting time? What's next? And then sort of the long shuttle era of not much going on. That being said, it wasn't until 2008 when we started investigating and making an offer that I led to invest in SpaceX that the deep interest in this whole area started. It was, I guess I could say one thing. Prior to that, I did launch model rockets with my son. So starting around 2003, when he was a 3-year-old, to the present day, we were just in the Black Rock Desert launching supersonic rockets last weekend. So that was perhaps a rekindling of a childhood interest with my children, the rediscovering childhood, if you will. And then I started collecting these space artifacts, which surround us here at our headquarters. That's been about, 10 years in the making, but that came after the SpaceX investment. So the sequence again was model rocketry, if anything, SpaceX as an investment, Planet Labs as an investment, and then the craziness in my office followed after that.
I like how he says model rockets and then go straight to supersonic rockets.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, he does model rockets like von Braun did model rockets. These are pretty serious. So you guided funds into SpaceX at not just a critical time for that company, but at a time, as I understand it anyway, in venture capital, where I think a lot of your contemporaries would have thought that's a long shot and maybe even stronger verbiage about really, right. How did you do that? Because that was not just daring, but probably very complicated.
Yeah, it's a good point to set the stage. And, once a company's had success, it seems obvious that one should have invested. But at the time, to try to set, the picture back in 2008 going into 2009, there was a long string of nothing, meaning the entire history of venture capital in space had not produced much in terms of returns. Like Tesla, which was an investment going on at the same time for me, there was a long history of failures. The road was littered with the train wrecks and wipeouts of the past. So you had decades of proven non-investability. You had almost nothing going on in the category. And so it was perfect for what I like to do. A company that is unlike anything I'd seen before, that if it succeeds will change the world, and in fact, multiple worlds for the better, to put a little tongue-in-cheek reference to Mars. And yes, it was difficult to get through the partnership. In fact, up until that point, almost everything I had proposed to the partnership for a vote had been almost rubber stamped, meaning it didn't get much pushback. None of the other partners were investing in the kinds of things I was doing, whether that be Tesla or what have you. And it was pretty easy for me. Life was simple. And then SpaceX was the first time where they just voted me down. So no, we're not going to let you invest in SpaceX. This is the largest check we've ever written at a higher valuation than we're used to. And, how in the world would you ever make more than 2 to 3 times your money? I mean, like paint that picture. How are we possibly going to make more than 2 times your money or 3 times maybe? So I took that no. not as a final answer, and went back, spent 2 weeks working through, a couple of partners who I thought I could persuade that if I added some protection, if you will, to the deal, some structure, as we call it in our industry, to protect our downside, meaning like if the company gets acquired or it goes public, we make at least 2 times our money, like a liquidation preference and an IPO liquidation preference as well. They got it through the partnership. Those terms, of course, are ridiculous, and and we got rid of them later. But nevertheless, it got it across the hump, and of course, it became one of our most successful investments at the time. But it was, to recap, not easy. Most people thought this is a fool's errand, and within the venture community, right, there was no one else making offers. Most competitors of SpaceX thought this is unlikely to succeed. The whole mission plan, the dream of going to Mars, the idea of reusable rockets, no one else was, not a single other company was signing up to that proposition at the time. So SpaceX was one of a kind. It had had a string of 3 failures in a row. That's also a bit daunting when you consider investment. But we really saw the potential there. They did have, a NASA COTS contract, of course, so that if they could execute, we knew revenue would follow, but they had to execute. And that's what we were willing to invest in. And so ultimately taking that risk was a good idea as investments go. And it's been straight and up to the right since then.
Well, now they play billionaires.
Just a quick follow-up. How did you get from, so you had an undergrad engineering degree, a graduate engineering degree, a graduate business degree. Had you decided at that point that you wanted to go into the business side, or was that a longer path?
No, the decision to go to the business side dates back to when I was at Hewlett Packard designing chips. And I just felt within that company, especially, that the time frame to having an impact on the world was long, like a 20-year kind of promote from within, lifetime employment. I didn't really appreciate that was HP specific, Hewlett Packard specific, and not so much the case as startups, which were entirely new to me. I had never worked for one. So I decided, gosh, how can I get into engineering management? I'll go to business school. How do I get to business school? Oh, I'll go to Bain. So that was sort of the thought process. And it's probably the only time in my entire career that things went according to my plan, which is I went to Bain and that got me to business school. But by that point, I no longer wanted to be an engineering manager, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So product marketing was an exploration over the summer. And someone I worked with at Bain, who was working at Greylock at the time, said, "Hey, we're interviewing. Would you like to come talk to us about a career in venture capital?" And I had no idea what we were talking about. So that's what catalyzed my exploration and shifted what ultimately I think is the best match with my interests and capabilities.
Wow.
I have another case study question for you, Steve, because you mentioned, we talked about SpaceX just right now, and you mentioned Planet Labs early on too. And I had the pleasure years ago, it feels like now, to visit Planet Labs back when it was still both Planet Labs, not just Planet like it is now. And to see like the office and where they were building the CubeSats, like in this glass room, they had like little nap centers. It was really interesting to see what a new startup was like, because I hadn't seen one. By then I'd been talking to Boeing and Lockheed for years, and so I'm wondering, about what you saw in Planet Labs when you, I guess, heard about them, and walk us through, like, okay, I've heard about them. They say they want to do this commercial Earth imagery and that they've got a business plan, but they're going to use CubeSats. What is that process like to what is now like a really big success story of these new space kind of approaches to commercial markets?
That's a great question. And a wonderful segue from SpaceX, because it was, in a sense, the prepared mind from seeing SpaceX and their trajectory for lowering launch costs that made us think through what are the next implications. How will this democratize access to space? What will lowering launch costs mean for the ecosystem at large? And what things might one be able to contemplate that were not really on the table prior? Things like disposable satellites that only last a year or two before they deorbit. That would have been unthinkable in a sense prior to at least the trajectory of lowering cost, or at least and through one method or another. So I first met the Planet Labs founders, interestingly, at a rocket launch event at the Black Rock Desert, same place I was last weekend, where my son and I have gone for 18 years. And there was this unusual combination of folks from Google with these Android HTC phones in NASA, or the NASA Ames location, who were talking about phone sats and the fact that they had tested that an off-the-shelf cell phone could do all the functions of a satellite. And in fact, I remember this vividly, had more memory and processing power than any satellite in orbit at the time. And that sort of demonstration mission, which it did fly eventually as PhoneSat with 3 satellites called Alexander, Graham, and Bell, demonstrated in some ways as a just almost like a stunt/demonstration mission, that you can use commercial off-the-shelf electronics and accomplish things with the benefit of Moore's law that really run circles around some traditional modalities. And if you ask yourself, where would a software-centric, processor-centric kind of approach work in space? Imaging is one and communications is another. And we'll get to that in communications part later. But certainly Earth imaging was one of the two big buckets of satellite industry at the time, right? Television relays being the other one, which, kind of a dying market, but you could lump into the communications sector, let's say. So we meet these folks out there. I then went to their first location, which was long before the location you just mentioned. This was in a garage in Cupertino, where, we met with the company, and I led their seed round before they incorporated, and their Series A as well, when they were in that building you just mentioned in San Francisco. And one of the reasons they had not incorporated was they were trying to decide if they wanted to be a benefit corp or a C corp, because they've always wanted to have a mission that allowed them to, not just become a military industrial complex kind of company. But I digress. The short version is we saw the opportunity to do something unlike anything else. So, here's a really memorable part. Those satellites, and still today, are 10,000 times cheaper than the thing they replaced, the Landsats. Now, Wow. It's not entirely fair. Landsats are pretty powerful and they last a long time. But you could put up a swarm of smaller satellites that are flying closer to the subject matter, the flock of doves, as we call them, and get similar imagery as Landsat at great distances. And anyone with, big camera lenses on a DSLR knows this. Like, wow, the lens gets heavy and expensive exponentially as you get a bigger telephoto lens. What if you just flew closer to your subject matter, being Earth? And the net implication is, and by the way, if it's a latest imager, the latest processor, it's just going to be so much cheaper. And this is the big change in new space writ large, is that there are so many places within the space economy where you see 100x to a 10,000x cost advantage if you just do a modern design approach with the latest components. And a simple reminder of that for most people, if you think about the top of the line rover on Mars right now, it has a 2 megapixel camera, because it was a 2004 design freeze. Like, wow. And that's just like a Dragon processor, like that people don't even remember what that was, right? Back in the Motorola days. And this is what we have roving around Mars. So like, even if, you let 10 years pass, if you just use today's processors, you're going to have 1,000-fold improvement in price performance by using today's chips versus 10-year-old chips. That simple insight has driven a lot of, I think, everything from launch vehicles to satellites to Starlink, you name it. You can do so much more today if you use commercial off-the-shelf products that benefit from Moore's law and benefit from, in a sense, the peace dividend of the cell phone wars, where they just beat each other up on price. You get processors, memory, and accelerometers for almost nothing.
Wow. So it's interesting you mentioned the age of the components on the rover, because I had a long discussion with the chief engineer on that project at one point about, I understand they have to be radiation hardened, but is there some other reason you're using a PowerPC chip designed in 1999 on NASA's newest rover? And part of it, he pointed out, was the fact that the larger chip with the larger transistor sets on it is more resistant to bit flipping by cosmic ray strikes. But you'd think, for the amount of mass they're carrying up there, you could sufficiently armor that in some way that it would be an issue.
And they also didn't want to take a risk on a new software stack. If they switch processors. But you're exactly right. This is one of the little devil details of miniaturization, is that soft error rates in SRAM cells in particular have gone up so much, even terrestrially, that you have multiple transistors dedicated to every bank for error correction codes. But there are absolutely rad hard versions of this that are commercially available. You could use, spin torque MRAM. There's a bunch of different things you could use for your memory if you wanted to.
So getting to the business side a little deeper, what specific characteristics, if there are specific characteristics or more general characteristics, do you look for before you're willing to guide investment into a new company or area of enterprise?
Well, there's a variety of things. So some are generic to any startup. There'd be, do you have passionate entrepreneurs who are looking to change the world, in a meaningful way, right? And they really care about what they're doing. They're not just trying to make a quick buck. So the sort of missionary, not mercenary, if you will. Today's geopolitical environment, you can really see the difference between those on the world stage. Second, of course, is it a big, huge market? Are we talking about, a multi-billion-dollar market if all goes well? And of course, do you have some unique approach? We often ask companies, could you have started this business 10 years ago? If the answer is yes, we have no interest. If the answer 5 years ago is yes, we pause, because almost nothing that's meaningful is just sitting out there as a pregnant idea no one's had for decades. Right? That just doesn't happen. So there's usually something, usually Moore's Law related in technology, or a change in regulation sometimes, or privatization sometimes, or maybe new channels of distribution like the internet or mobility that are, every so often. But the Moore's Law crunch is usually the thing that you can count on. What can we simulate now we couldn't simulate before? What can we do high throughput experimentation on in some artificial rig like never before? How can we just make a traditionally crappy industrial business like automotive, aerospace, agriculture, construction, and so forth into a software-centric, simulation-centric, modern economy? Those kinds of questions, right? But then we at Future Ventures add one more filter that most other venture firms won't mention. I've never heard anyone else say that this is their filter, but it is one for us, which is this company unlike anything we've seen before, yet adjacent to things we've seen or invested in or feel familiar with? So we don't just randomly pogo stick around things we know nothing about, but, is there some frontier of expanding technology futures that this is adjacent to, yet no one's tried this before in this way? That's a hard filter, by the way. So, that asks the entrepreneur to both have this sort of huge audacious dream. We're going to re-engineer the world for the better. We're going to colonize Mars. We're going to make all vehicles electric, for example, as dreams. Yet we have pragmatic steps of how to get there. We got a Falcon 1. We got a not so great Tesla Roadster, the first one, that we get to market. We iterate with customers. We learn and we execute with a more rapid learning cycle than any other company. That's the cycle of success we look for, which is we get started. We have a big dream. It attracts the best people to join. And we iterate more quickly than anyone else. Inevitably that wins.
I should follow up, Steve. When you're talking about Moore's Law, you're talking about observing and projecting trends, right? As for folks that maybe don't follow what that means when you're making an investment decision.
Yeah, well, yes. So I reference Moore's Law as like the one thing we can hang our hat on for the next 5 to 10 years and longer, I would assume, in technology futures. Whereas there isn't much else you can say. I know for sure that 5G is going to roll out by this date, and we're going to have the following, whatever, 5 years, 10 years out. Whereas Moore's Law, the way I look at it, has actually been going on for 122 years, long before there was Intel, long before there were semiconductors, long before there were integrated circuits. It's basically, what do people actually buy? It's computation or storage. And if you look at either of those, say, how much computation can a dollar buy? How many calculations per second? That has been compounding continuously, doubling every year for 122 years. That, by the way, over 122 years is a 10 billion X improvement in cost performance of computing. And there's no real reason it should end, even though Intel, of course, keeps saying it's ending because they handed the mantle to NVIDIA. NVIDIA is handing now to various custom chips. So like Tesla makes their own custom chips for their cars and for their data centers. So does Google, et cetera. So you have this sort of steady march of computational advance. Humanity's, which is kind of profound if you think about it. Humanity's capacity to compute has been compounding continuously for 122 years, for as long as we've been able to have measurements. So probably going to continue for another 5 or 10. That's a bet I'm willing to make. And therefore, you can think about what is at the edge of automation today? What is really hard, but we can barely do it, and we know next generation can, like autonomous cars, or in fact, autonomous spacecraft. Like every component of the SpaceX product suite is an autonomous vehicle. Booster, upper stage, Dragon capsule, each fairing, the boat that catches it, every one of those is a fully autonomous vehicle. So it's a great example of a software stack defining the product, same as it is in our cars. And you can imagine now, 10 years in the future, nothing will matter more than the software stack in your car. Every other product feature, every physical feature will fade into irrelevance compared to that software stack, just as it is with your phone today. All right. Your next phone will look just like your current phone. It will. There's not going to be any difference in the way that thing looks. Yet the software and services stack will keep improving. And yeah, sure, they're literally putting new versions of Moore's Law in the processors and imagers, but it's Moore's Law and the software stack on top of it that matters.
Well, I'm hoping you're the person that finally gets the cell phone companies to start building transparent phones like they had on the Expanse, even though those are probably impractical. But that aside, I have another investment question, and I'm going to ask you as soon as we come back from the short break. So this is one of those kind of double negative questions, I guess, but have there been any kinds of investments or areas that you wish you had gone into sooner, or do you feel like you pretty much hit it down the middle?
Oh, that's interesting. Areas. Well, I'd say Yes, there are companies and maybe even sectors. I have to think more about sectors that I wish I'd gotten into earlier, but with two caveats. None of them are in the space sector. So there isn't any company I wish I had invested in, even with hindsight, even if I could go back and cherry pick an earlier round. And that's a pretty profound, pretty strong and somewhat negative statement. But there are definitely ones that we missed. I mean, God, I was close to, but didn't pursue PayPal enough. We were the underbidder on Facebook. Like literally, we just stopped at 100 million. We're like, we can't see paying more than 100 million valuation for any company at that time, and so forth. So there's plenty that got away. In fact, the ones that got away at a company level are more painful than, in a sense, investing in the wrong company. So our business model as a venture capitalist suffers more if we miss a winner than if we invest in a loser, if you will. So given the asymmetric power laws of returns, there are, oh my gosh. In terms of sectors, though, I had one other caveat. So the other big things, I've been early more often as a mistake than late. So I've made bad decisions in investing in nanotech in the 2002 timeframe. Luckily, only 2 or 3 companies, molecular electronics in particular. And basically, ways to solve that SRAM bit flip problem you mentioned, the soft error rate was motivating. I invested in 3 different companies that were, and one of them is public now, and one got acquired and one failed. Trying to invent the next generation of memory, because that actually rose early on in my mind as a big problem that needs solving. How can we scale memory? But I digress. Let me just come back to space and say, there have been a lot of sectors. I keep looking, but we've only invested in SpaceX and Planet Labs. There are 500 other venture groups that have invested in space startups since 2015, just in a 5-year period. From 2015 to 2020. That's kind of astounding. From like nothing, remember we were talking about earlier, to SpaceX. And then 2015 was a watershed year. There was 1.1 billion invested in SpaceX and Planet Labs combined. And that investment alone, those 2 companies, exceeded all prior venture investing throughout all history combined times 2. And then from that year on, it's just going up and up and up, like billions of dollars every year subsequent. And many venture firms made their first investment in space in that time period. 180, I think it's now made close to 190 small sat launch vehicles got invested in, for example. I've never seen anything like it. They're all going after the same niche. So that's not a sector that I wanted to or would have, in retrospect, wish I'd invested in. It's like the one that's absorbed the most, certainly, human attention. I think there's still a lot to be done. I don't mean to be a naysayer on space as a market sector by any means, but there hasn't been a specific one that I currently think, oh, wow, dang it. I wish I'd invested in that one.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, is there an area of space enterprise that you avoid like the plague? But it sounds like no, from what you're describing, unless it's really just like far
no,
out.
but with the filters I mentioned earlier. So remember that simple filter, somewhat unique to us, perhaps, that we try and invest in something that's unlike anything we've seen before. Well, the very first small sat launch company to come in our doorstep, right? It's now a public company, of course. I'm like, well, the Falcon 1 did that. So I'm like, by our simple filters, like, no, thank you. And then the next one and the next one. And then when there were 20, it was like a little easier to say no. And then by the 100th, I'm like, what are you guys thinking? And then the 150th, like, why are you starting another small sat launch company? It was mind blending. And so I did get enthralled and would take a pause and ask if there was a completely different way, like a non-chemical rocket. There was a company in Colorado at one point trying to do microwave beamed energy that ended up not working, but at least that's worth taking a meeting, because if that did work, it'd be unlike anything I've seen before. Or maybe, the centrifugal spin ones or things of that sort. So, or the rail guns, there's certainly been plenty of projects, but no one's actually commercialized any of that yet. So to that end, I've also not been a fan of asteroid mining for different reasons, but it's basically the first thing I said, is there a big market? Is it something no one's done before? And do you have a near-term path with customers? Is there some way you can engage with customers within the next 2 or 3 years, not hunker down for 20 years, come out the other side with some, major revelation? So with those filters, almost everything that I've seen in the last 10 years has not been meeting those filters.
And how are those companies going to make a profit in space? You mentioned, the SpaceX's success and whatnot. And as someone that doesn't follow investing, it's always hard for me to understand how people and investors get their, how those profits, actually are made. Because it seems like developing a private space program like these companies are doing in their own niche is massively expensive, and those returns take years.
Exactly. So I think you're spot on. And this is further underscoring why there's a lot of them I don't find that interesting, like suborbital tourism, for example, just a non-starter as a business. So when you say profit, there's two levels. How do you make profit as an investor, which could be riding a hype wave and short-term, sort of arbitrage seeking opportunism, right? That's not what we do, but you can make money that way. Some of the SPAC sponsors made money that way. They're in and out within a year or two. Who cares what the long-term business looks like, right? You just catch a hype wave. Again, that's not what we do. The more important profit question would be, how does the business make money in the long run? And ideally, if we're holding for a long period, like our venture funds are 15-year funds instead of the usual 10-year funds, we were in it for the long haul. I also, by the way, I never personally sell a share of anything I invest in. So I'm in it for a longer haul oftentimes than the entrepreneurs themselves, because I literally never sell a single share. So I'm thinking 50 years from now, 500 years from now, does this company even exist? What is its purpose and mission? And like, will it just be something that comes and goes? So to that question, you need, quite simply, like with any business, to have, customers that are willing to pay more than it costs you to provide the service. So launch is a great example. I don't understand how you're going to enter the market at a price 100 times higher than the current market price from SpaceX. But hey, normally in business, you offer a price that's good value, customer buys it, and you make a profit margin on it. So that's how SpaceX works. Pretty straightforward. Same with Starlink, right? You've got a lot of upfront costs, as everyone knows, right? Launching and building this network, but then you recoup it over many years with the, the service contracts with customers. That's a well understood business model, not too dissimilar from any other broadband data. You invest in fiber, you make it up over many, many years. And, those are very bankable business propositions. So, Starlink as a business, SpaceX as a business, very easy to see how they get to profitability. And in the case of Starlink in the future, and in the case of SpaceX, they have been. So it's not even a question. They've been profitable for many years. Planet Labs, you can see the same path. You put up an infrastructure of satellites, you charge for imagery, you're so much better than the alternatives that came before you. And that is what, if you look at any analyst tracking that public stock, you'd see that's what they're forecasting for the future. I think it's important though, when you jump to what often are government funded programs, what is the business model for colonization? What is the business model for going to the moon? And there may not be one as currently constructed, but that easily could be, right? Especially when you think about resource extraction, when you think about tourism, there's actually a whole bunch of business models that we talk about, but there it's less, how should I put it? It's less obvious which will be the dominant model. There's a lot of contenders for those business models, but the timing and the magnitude are a little bit less known, right?
So my first long conversation with you, I think, was when I was interviewing you for Space 2.0, which is, I wrote that in 2017 through 2019. And at the time, I talked to a number of leaders from the European Space Agency and a couple in Asia about private investment. And they kind of lamented that their countries and markets didn't have the kind of investment structure or tax advantages that the U.S. did, and that was, in their opinion, slowing the pace of international investment. Has that changed, or do you see that changing significantly in the future, or is this going to be a U.S. game for quite a while?
It's interesting. I think it's largely a U.S. and Chinese game, depending on which sector you're looking at, and that China with a totally different kind of economic model. They do have entrepreneurship and they do have startups, but it's not quite the same economy, right? But to your question, I don't see any change in Europe so far, meaning, all of the meaningful change. Here, let me give you a sweeping generalization that I've yet to find any counterexample, that all meaningful change, meaningful meaning the kind of change that history books will be written about, and I think SpaceX clearly is earning its place in that pantheon. Those kinds of changes always come from new entrants. They never come from an incumbent business revolutionizing or disrupting their core, right? So, and by the way, sometimes people point to Apple, I'm not talking about in any industry ever in the history of the world. There are no counterexamples of this. So when Apple innovates, it innovates in an industry it wasn't in before, going to music and then to mobile phones. Hewlett Packard, another famous example from the past, wasn't in computing. It's when they got into printers. They're like, oh, wow, they were innovative. So big companies can innovate outside their core. So if you look to, the European or any other space company, it's not blowing up its current business. It's not saying, let's revolutionize the way it happens. And it's still astounding to me that they have nothing currently seriously in development to even compete with the Falcon 9, much less Starship, most importantly, right? Like a fully reusable rocket. Only China's talking about trying to do that and devote resources towards that, at least investigating that future. So, stepping back, you might say, why have we seen less out of Europe over the last 20 years? That's because you said less startups coming out of Europe, which is a whole different set of questions. Why are there less startups? Because if you don't have new entrants, you're not going to have innovation. That's the juggernaut of the future. But again, qualification, innovation that matters in a sense of meaningful progress for humanity. There's, of course, sustaining innovation, making anything that's big and huge 10% better is, of course, a noble goal. Pick an industry, make it 10% better, fine. History books aren't written about that. It doesn't move the needle for humanity and progress, but still good to do. There's plenty of that going on in Europe, but startups are much less common than in the US. So then China, they have sort of a space race underdog thing going with the US. I think that drives a lot of government efforts. They're having a moon program. They want to have people on the moon within the next 10 years. They have a lot of things going on that are quite vivacious. And you might imagine they would actually accomplish some of these goals because they have been, in contrast to a lot of other places in the world. I'd say, by the way, also within the US, there isn't like a direct US competitor to SpaceX yet that says, hey, we're going to do that too. Like, can you imagine, by the way, like in any other tech industry, if someone came up and said, imagine databases and some company like Salesforce.com pops up and says, we're going to revolutionize enterprise software. It's going to be in the cloud. And this was a big idea at first, right? Oracle doesn't just sit back and say, oh, we can't compete with that. We're going to shut down all our product lines. Like, really? Like they would, of course, lie and say, of course, we're all over the cloud. Oracle Cloud, we've got this covered. And then actually put people against it and try to deliver a cloud-based service in catch-up mode. In the aerospace, they're like, no, sorry, we don't have any R&D program whatsoever to try to do anything like this. We're going to go out of business unless someone gives us a lot of money. That is a really weird competitive stance. And internationally, China said we can't compete with SpaceX on price, even if we had Western technology. That was the first reaction to Falcon 9 pricing going online. I just never seen anything like it in business. I mean, do you really just not do R&D? And if you do, are you in such denial that it takes you 5 or 10 years of proven success before you say, I guess it has been working for 5 or 10 years now. Maybe we'll try to do that too.
And you want to ask some of the established aerospace giants, is it as hard as you make it sound to design your own rocket engines? Because there's these guys down in Hawthorne that have been doing that for years, since the beginning. And yet the established companies, and I get that, they're shareholder owned and all that, but watching ULA wait for the BE-4 from Blue Origin is painful.
Yeah. I think it was a 25-year stint between major liquid fueled engines before SpaceX entered. It may be analogous to the large system integrators, if you will, in the automotive industry, who have long since atrophied all their software skills, right, to Delco and Conti and Bosch. And when it came time to re-engineer the car around software and services, they're like, we don't have any people to do that, right? We got to restaff. For autonomous driving, do we buy this? Buy a startup? How do we possibly catch up when the entire playing field is shifted? This is why, as disruption-seeking investors, this is why we look for this, right? Coming back to, take an industry that hasn't seen a meaningful entrant for decades, come at it with a Silicon Valley-like software services-centric kind of re-engineering, and it's just the beautiful thing. It's like some of the most attractive business economics for the new entrant you'll ever see. Witness Tesla and SpaceX. And oh, by the way, in our business, we're looking for similar patterns in construction and agriculture, as I mentioned. By the way, digging tunnels. The 4 companies that lead in that business before boring were all started in the 1800s. So there's a lot of these industries like that out there.
Wow.
You said 2 things that I wanted to follow up on, Steve. Number one is you said earlier that suborbital was a non-starter, and of course that's where 2 of the 3 space tourism companies that are out there right now are focused on. And then you said that it's really hard for that business case for the moon or whatnot. And of course that's where a lot of the lofty dreams are about settling space, where you've got people on the moon or on Mars or whatnot. And I'm curious if you see in that crystal ball that you have to look into, to make those computations, where you see the settlement of space coming in to all of the like the venture funding, in the future. And if tourism is a part of that or an early driver, like we're seeing with these trips to the space station and whatnot.
Yeah. So let me not mislead in saying that I'm not lumping suborbital tourism and lunar exploration in the same bucket. They're very different. I think there's all kinds of motivations to go to the moon, and it's a stepping stone to so much more. I mean, to Mars and to colonies and to resource extraction. There's a lot going on the moon. So let me be more precise. I'd say it's not entirely certain which of those business models will be the most lucrative, but I'm not saying they're not good, right? There's all kinds. In other words, it's almost like an abundance of opportunity. In contrast, suborbital is a dead end. You don't build capabilities that you then use to go orbitally. You don't use those launch vehicles in an orbital program, right? The energy difference is like 25x. Or I'll be more precise. You take a company like Virgin Orbit, or Virgin Galactic rather, very different companies. Orbit and Galactic are no synergies between them at all, as Branson points out. But Virgin Galactic, when they talk about a future product and it's a hypersonic plane, it's like they can't use the rubber burning engine they've got today. That hybrid engine is not powerful enough for hypersonic flight. So in a sense, it's a complete reboot, restart to move from what they're currently doing to whatever their next product is. There's just nothing about their existing business or customer base or technology stack that has anything to do with some other future that anyone cares about, right? Just going up and down is not that interesting. The second thing is, as tourism goes, it's pretty anemic. It's like, you launch out of New Mexico, and I did this analysis like on Google Earth and other places. Just look at like, what is your field of view? And you're going to see New Mexico. And New Mexico is kind of self-similar. It's like a fractal set of scales. You could be literally a commercial airline or in Virgin Galactic, and they're not that different. You have a short period of weightlessness, which you could do 10 times cheaper, 20 times cheaper, arguably, with zero gravity flights, which I've done, parabolic flights. And you could go in these future coming balloons if you really want to, hang out at, an altitude that sees the blackness of space and sees a local region and take some photos. So the alternatives are so much better that I was like, so obvious to me, even before either Bezos's bouncy house or Virgin Galactic happened, that this is like, what's the point, right? It's going to become really uncouth to brag about, I'm an astronaut, right? It's like saying I flew first class in an airplane. I'm a aeronaut, right? That kind of loses its cachet after a few trips.
My mother,
you don't have the overview effect. You don't have a long weightlessness period. That's really, you get a few minutes of weightlessness. Okay, so you got that. Can't deny that. You don't see much. The reason the astronauts were so enthralled by being in space is because they're going 17,500 miles an hour in orbit, and they're seeing the Earth pass under their face, with a sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes, circling Earth every 90 minutes. That's where you get the overview effect. So to me, suborbital is dead as a business. Technology doesn't lead anywhere, and the business opportunity, I think, withers over time because it's just like, why do that? Oh, especially when something really interesting like orbital comes up, right? So if you look at the future of Starship, and you look at the cost curves there, it's really hard to fathom a future where that's on the planet and any suborbital tourism still goes, because you could fly in orbit around the Earth for less than it costs to go in a commercial airline coach.
I'll take that.
You let that sink in. Why in the world would you spend $200,000 to do a bouncy house? That just kills the business, in my opinion. And in the meantime, Jared and Isaacman and others are showing that, EVAs and spacewalks and really exciting missions like going to the moon and going to orbit around the moon and doing EVA around the moon like Superman and like shooting at really low altitudes in lunar orbit. This would be exciting. This is fun. A high altitude hop, not so much.
My mother says they're not real astronauts. So,
you watch that.
That's what she told me. So, all right, sorry. Go ahead, Ron. I know you got questions.
I did a whole article about that. Okay, so Steve, you've been a good friend of the National Space Society, and you've been a good citizen in Newspace in so many ways. But I got to ask, when you're talking about human space flight versus robotic, and you've invested in both, what are in the long term, what are your personal views on moving humans into space, both for specific task areas and just in this bigger question of space settlement, which, we've watched? It's been 50 years plus since we last landed on the moon with humans. what do you have a big picture sense here, and why that makes sense? Both, and it's up to you whether you want to talk about it from a business perspective or just a human perspective.
Sure. I think we inevitably are going to live and work in space. It's hard to imagine any future where we don't, especially if you look far enough in the future. So question of timing, of course, but look 500 years in the future, really? Like we wouldn't have human settlements on the moon and Mars? Like how could that possibly be a future that transpires? And oh, by the way, we'll get to this later, and possibly in free-floating, rotating colonies as well. So the robotic versus human question, I think, really has to do with the targets and the motivations, which is there are many places in our solar system and almost certainly beyond our solar system where robots are the answer. Meaning we won't send humans, I think, ever interstellar. We'll come back to that if you want. I don't think for many of the harshest places in our solar system, it makes as much sense to send them. So if you want to do science, sending a robot, a robotic mission, Europa, you name it, it's just going to make more sense, right? That's motivating the scientists. I wish the whole planet was made of scientists. I wish the whole planet would be as curious as we are probably on this podcast, for what we could learn on the frontiers of the unknown, exploring these worlds, understanding astrobiology, understanding, the world we live in, how our solar system came to be, et cetera, right? That's really exciting. Unfortunately, I'm not sure everyone on planet Earth is as excited as we are. Sending humans somewhere does inspire humanity, right? That's a qualitatively different thing that everyone on planet Earth, I think, can understand. It may go down in history as one of the greatest evolutionary moments, like the opposable thumb or neocortex of we became multiplanetary, right? Where we have a hedge. And oh, by the way, you don't need to think about all the things that could go ugly in humanity and snuffing ourselves out. You don't have to worry about asteroid defense, although that should be doable now, thanks to the space economy and Surveyor and B612 and others saying we can actually protect ourselves from asteroid strike. But then supervolcanoes, you can't quite rule them out. Yellowstone exploding or something. So, if you want just a mental model for the zombie apocalypse, just think supervolcanoes. And wouldn't it be great if we had a way to back up life, to have something other than a single lifeboat? So while Earth is important and people like to say there's no planet B, we might need a planet A prime, something that is our backup. Right? Wouldn't it be horrible to have the entire life of humanity, everything that we've ever learned, everything we've ever accomplished, snuffed out in a way we can't control? Okay. So, that future involves humans living in a world where they can be self-sufficient and can reproduce. This makes Mars much more attractive than the moon, right? Because again, if Earth is destroyed, a lunar economy is likely going to rely on Earth for quite some time. The natural resources, the scale of it, the lack of atmosphere, there's a number of challenges. It's possible that a colony would live and thrive forever on the moon with the Earth not being a supply base, but it's a lot harder. Mars offers certain advantages in that regard. But in both cases, there's one very important branch point, in my opinion, is we need to understand if mammalian reproduction works in moon or Mars gravity, right? So the very low gravity of the moon might not. A lot of people intuitively think that embryonic reproduction and fetal development isn't going to work in lunar gravity, but we've never tested it. Mars at 38% of Earth's gravity is just closer. It's more likely to work, yet untested. And I think a future branch point for humanity's prioritization of either spinning colonies in 1G or Mars, hellbent for Mars or bust, is going to pivot on whether we do some experiments that show that this is possible. And I think these experiments should cost less than $10 million, by the way. Kind of like B612, which was doing asteroid defense before there was near Surveyor, to protect Earth from all asteroid strikes is roughly in the order of $400 million all in. Some people spend that much on a single museum. And you could protect all the artifacts of Earth from at least asteroid strike for the same amount of money. But until recently, there wasn't the capital to do that. And I'm not even sure it's fully funded, but it's kind of sad to me that we wouldn't fully fund that. And that, by the way, comes back to Moore's law. It's because of our ability to computationally model the trajectory of the n-body problems, of all these trajectories of asteroids that makes it computationally possible to look out 50 or 100 years and do what, of course, the DART mission and others have done, is that once we detect an incoming threat, decades before it hits, bang into it to make the delta V accumulate and integrate over time and save life on Earth from asteroid strikes. That's just now we can do that. it wasn't possible 20 years ago. Computationally, it wouldn't be worth it to monitor all these objects that we couldn't model that many years in advance. So it's an incredible confluence of Moore's law and control systems in spacecraft that we can now defend Earth. So that's like check. But it would be a shame not to understand how we're going to live in space. And as I step back, it's like, wow, like there've been attempts, but PETA shut some of them down in the US. Japan's done some research with a centrifuge and a Kibo module on the space station, but they've never tested mammalian reproduction. It's like, why not send pregnant guinea pigs into space at all different types of ages of gestation and just see what happens? Do they have a live birth or not? If they do, awesome. If they don't, let's do some more studies. And why is that?
Well, that I think that gets to the final question, especially when it comes to space investment. I get asked this a lot, Steve. It's always a question that a media interviewer is going to ask. It's like, why even pay for any of it, right? Like, what's the benefit to spending all of this money to go into space for any duration, suborbital, the moon, Mars, or whatever, when we've got all sorts of stuff on Earth? Now, I feel like you've kind of hinted at that with this long range impact on the society at large that you're looking for when you're looking for a good investment. But when people ask you, like, why are you even interested in space? Why should we be there in the first place? What is the why bother response that,
right? I love this question. So first, at a high level, I think it's a false dichotomy, right? It's not like Earth or, it's Earth and it becomes all the more clear in a commercial space context. So in the past, when you had a space race and you had the military industrial complex, doing a bunch of stuff that was like a one-off and then ended, it was a little less apparent how all the spin-off technologies in terms of our military industrial complex benefited the military industrial complex, right? I'm sure there were, NASA spin-offs, but it was not nearly as dramatic as where we are today. So as a simple example, consider Starlink. Right? Here you have a company that first lowers the cost of access to space, then enables things like Starlink and Planet Labs and others to take advantage of that to build the applications, if you will, in space that we all benefit from. In anyone navigating with GPS, anybody, looking at imagery around the world for environmental purposes or science, what have you, can see the benefits. And by the way, when we have broadband anywhere and your cell phone connects, anywhere on planet Earth, we all feel the benefit of space. And the reason this is happening so beautifully from a company whose goal is to colonize Mars. Let's not forget that. SpaceX was founded with the dream of accelerating the colonization of Mars. And there's a big picture of Mars every employee sees when they walk through headquarters at Hawthorne. Nevertheless, because they're integrating with customers along the way and learning, iterating with those customers, they're building products and services that matter, that people pay for, that help life on Earth every step of the way. And so that's why it's already paying dividends, if you will, long before we've ever sent anyone to Mars, right? Again, Starlink being the canonical example, and everything else that's benefiting from the lowering cost of access to space. So the analogy I once drew, and I still believe in it, is like, if you think about the internet and how much that's helped the economy, how much that's helped people all over the place. The internet, great thing, right? Well, first there was the fiber broadband build out. There was like all these different methods by which you could access the internet. And so SpaceX, by analogy, is giving us access to space. Now there's all the applications being built. So Planet Labs and Starlink and by the way, new sensor modalities going up into space, very large arrays being used in new and creative ways, new types of telescopes that blow the doors off the telescopes we've had, new communication links like we've never had before, ubiquitous, persistent Earth observation, communication, and sensor networks. Pretty interesting. Modeling the weather like never before, right? This is just beginning, right? We're going to have incredible information with hyperspectral imagers. And okay, it just goes on and on and on. So get the satellites up there cheaply. All this other stuff follows. That is benefiting life on Earth. So take the environmental movement, right? It's not just that inspiration of the picture of the pale blue dot, Earth from Apollo 17, that is the most reproduced image ever photographed. And it's not that, it's the data. How are reservoirs doing? How is climate changing? What are the temperatures and the heights of the oceans with synthetic aperture radar being measured everywhere? It just goes on and on and on. When companies like Planet monitor the entire Earth, every meter of Earth every day, and you have these continuity studies, you can count every tree on Earth every day, right? Think what that can do. You can catch illegal deforestation and illegal fishing as it happens. You can see these things from space. We're just beginning to tap into the application layers that come from persistent, again, sensors, persistent communication, and creativity, frankly, unleashed by lower cost of access. So I'm a huge fan of, space is the place for the human race, and it will help us save face here on Earth as well.
That's a nice rhyme. I
just made that
so
up to the save face. That was kind of dorky, but you started with some bad jokes, so.
I always do, and you can't beat my jokes for bad. So I've gotten through about half my questions, but we've got to wrap this up. So I hope you'll join us again. This has been really fun, and I want to thank you for making time for us. I want to thank our listeners for welcoming Steve to the show. I could do this all day, but another day. So Steve, while we've got you, where can people learn more about what you're up to? Sure.
On Twitter, Future Jurvetson. On Facebook and Flickr, which is the old website for photos, I'm just username Jurvetson. And I try to post every day something interesting. Most of it's space related.
And your collection is viewable on Flickr as well, at least a substantial piece of it. Yeah. Which is, if people haven't gone there, you definitely want to page through that because it really is.
One teaser on that. I have a piece of every lunar module that's been to the moon, which takes a bit of time to figure out what it means. If they've been to the moon and they never came back, how do you have a piece of the actual spacecraft that was on the moon? And I do. I'll leave that as an exercise for the listener.
I haven't tracked it carefully, but I was talking to Buzz Aldrin about a year ago, and he was getting ready to put the breaker switch from the Apollo 11.
He did.
The Ascent engine. Did that get sold or?
No, he had a reserve price that was, I think it went from several $100,000 in bidding, but it didn't hit his secret reserve price, whatever that was. I think it may have been like a $750,000 reserve price. This is the switch that broke to get you off the moon. That was a source of great consternation to Neil Armstrong.
Well, and a lot of people on the ground.
Tariq, we should make sure we put a link to that Flickr set for people to look at because
it's a good idea. It's a good idea. Same question for you, sir.
People can find me at space.com as always. This weekend they can find me sleeping because for the first time in forever there are no rocket launches this weekend. Thank you, Hurricane Ian, for those delays at least, but not for all of the horribleness on Florida for sure. So thinking about those folks too.
Well, cry me a river, guy with a travel budget. You can stalk me at pylebooks.com or at astromagazine.com. Please don't forget to drop us a line at twis@twit.tv. That's twis@twit.tv. We welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas. Once more, twis@twit.tv. We love your comments, and we do answer each and every email. Thanks for joining us for this discussion with Steve Jurvetson, guiding investment into humanity's future. And don't forget, new episodes published every Friday in your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe and tell your friends and give us good reviews. You can also head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. And you can follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook and twit.tv on Instagram. Do it all. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, the Untitled Linux Show, the Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.